Hi, welcome to session 2 of the idea of progress in the making of modern America. Now, what we're going to be doing in this session is moving forward in our discussion of the scientific and technological revolution. We actually started that again in session 1, looking at the advent of modern science with the new principles and ideas of Isaac Newton, the British mathematician, again, of the late 1600s, early 1700s, back in Europe, again, who is really proposing a new version of reality that, according to him, is material and has to be studied in a very materialistic way, looking at material causes, material explanations, and gathering material observations and facts in order to understand how the world works, because after all, he said, it's just a machine that functions in a very mechanical way, that everything that occurs in nature occurs because of a natural mechanism. Those are the laws of nature, the mechanisms, and we're here just to discover them. In other words, those laws. And so, we discussed, of course, the kind of science that preceded it, the old science based on religion, spiritual forces moving the world, because those spiritual entities or forces were believed to be living inside, they were embedded inside of nature. So therefore, the cause of natural happenings and events happening in the natural or human world, again, were all caused by spirits. And the solutions were also spiritual or religious. In any cases, like rituals and so on. We cover that. Now, what we're going to be doing here is really just moving forward with that. And again, looking at, we looked, of course, at the principles of modern science that Newton brought about, of secularism, for example. The idea that the reality is material, the here and the now, for example, that this world, this material world, should be studied, should be understood, that it's important to know how to handle it, because ultimately this is going to enable us, to not only understand it, but at the same time use that knowledge again to solve many problems as well that arise in the natural world. And so again, the idea of secularism is simply secularism again is just something that science introduced, a new version of reality that is very material, and that people should be concerned about the material existence, the material side of life, and take care of it and develop it because it's ultimately real, and not necessarily just abandon it or ignore it just because it was important for people to be looking at the afterlife, as the source of happiness. So again, secularism again is once again a vision that is deeply rooted in matter. Okay, that societies, people in general, should develop their material bodies, their material communities, existences, and understand it and know how it works because it's real. In other words, it's not that this is an illusion. This is what Newton said. And of course, the scientific method was the method that he proposed to go about discovering the laws of nature, called empiricism and positivism. This is the method of the scientific community today, in which they have to gather facts from observation. The method is, in order to know anything, you have to see it, you have to experience it with your five senses, detect it again with your five senses, in order to know how that which you're studying, let's say, disease or sickness, or rain, or earthquakes, etc., to know what are the mechanisms, the material mechanisms that produce it, in other words. And if you're able to see that over and over again, and others can actually verify what you're seeing and document it, then you have a consensus and agreement that is a fact, in other words, that you have arrived to a scientific truth, in other words. And so that's the scientific method. Everything has to be experienced materially, and not just deducted. You cannot deduce that something happens because you thought about it, you dreamed about it, and so on. You have to experiment in the real world and see it, and so on. So it's a very materialistic approach to looking at reality and studying it. Now, what just it has to be also stated here is how that system proposed by Newton is going to really start replacing the old scientific system based on religion. As we cross the 1700s, which was really the century of the scientific revolution, it was also called the century of the Enlightenment. New ideas were proposed in Europe about politics, about economics, about society, science. Again, it was the flourishing of all the ideas of today we call modernity, like the ideas of political representation, democracy, for example, capitalism, you name it. So it was a very important century that really brought our age that we live in today, the modern age. So as this old science has been displaced and more scientists are following the scientific method of Newton called empiricism or positivism, by the 1800s, it had become the mainstream science of a number of European countries and also the United States. Undeniably, again, the scientists are now using Newton's ideas to understand the world around them, to gather facts about how the world works and so on. And there were very much hopes and expectations placed on that science. It was a new science that people had more faith in than in the science of the past. So much so that there were philosophers and scientists that were really proposing that this new science was now the supreme and ultimate revelation of the human intellect, that human intelligence had not now arrived to the exact and correct way of actually going about and studying the world. In other words, we finally got it. This is what scientists were saying back then, and praising the new science as, again, the supreme science, the supreme truth, in other words. So much so that there was a lot of expectations placed on this new science for creating this new civilization that was emerging again before everybody's eyes at that time. And again, one clear example of this, again, is the publication of Auguste Comte, the Positivist philosophy in 1842. He's really, again, saying that we finally arrived to a method for uncovering all of the mysteries of the universe. Maybe we haven't yet revealed them, he said, but we're on the way of actually uncovering, revealing all of the mysteries of life and the universe, how the universe was created, how it works, what are the forces of nature. Again, and he was very critical, of course, of the ways people studied the universe in the past based on religion and magic, criticizing those societies in the past as superstitious and so on. He was very critical of that, of course. And now he's saying, well, we just, transcended that era, in which we were relying on superstition and so on to understand the world, because now, he said, again, those are his ideas, I repeat, those are not, again, my own. I do not necessarily endorse those ideas, but what Comte was really just, he was just reflecting what the scientific community, philosophers, educators were also thinking. Again, he was not alone, again, in those pronouncements. People of the time had a lot of faith in the new science. Again, so now the most important thing, again, of the positivist philosophy, that was very, very revealing. Again, it was not just like, oh, wow, we just finally, got a scientific method that is really enabling us to understand the mysteries of the universe, and we're going to actually discover them. But that's what Comte was suggesting, and this is the general attitude of the time, is that people believed that this science, the ultimate promise, in other words, of this new science called modern science, was not just to gather knowledge for the sake of knowledge and to be just knowledgeable of the universe. But what he's suggesting here is that the ultimate goal, the ultimate promise of modern science is to enable human beings to actually master and control nature. Okay, so because what human beings are going to do with this knowledge? Okay, are you just going to store it, file it, keep it there, and write about it? Or the idea is that to use that knowledge to empower people, to empower human beings. And that's exactly what he was referring to, that knowledge is power, and that more knowledge you gather, that this is going to empower people to actually solve many of the problems of the past that afflicted humanity, sickness, disease, catastrophes, floodings, and so on, that we were going to be able to handle all of that with this new knowledge. But ultimately, the goal is that instead of just being at the mercy of nature, human beings being victims of the forces of nature, that we were going to become the masters of the universe, in other words, and control it. Maybe control the weather, control all of that, in other words. Kind of take the role of God, in other words, become creators and so on. So again, this is very, very, quote unquote promising, because this is what really, in many cases, drives science. It's not just a tool to solve problems, but ultimately to be able to control the forces that threaten, of course, humanity, or perhaps extend the lifespan of individuals, stop aging, live longer, immortal. In other words, to become immortal, to live forever, and so on. To avoid death, in other words. That's really the ultimate threat for any human being. So, if you think about it again, what, Comte and others were really suggesting is that religion was going to be replaced by science, because what he said is that why people appeal to God. Why is it that people pray to the gods or do rituals? It's to solve problems. Whenever we face a crisis, we pray. Again, whenever we're in any problems or trouble, again, we appeal to the divine for assistance, for protection, for etc. And so what he's actually suggesting is that more and more people are going to be now jumping ship, so to speak, and instead rely more on scientists for answers. Whenever there's a problem, people would like to now have, the scientific community do research and come up with some solution in order to solve that problem. So what he's actually suggesting is that the future civilization was going to be more and more scientific oriented than religious, that is to say. Okay, so this kind of helps explain, where we're going as a society in terms of, well, if we are really establishing this science and relying on it and so on, so eventually, again, the tendency is that scientists will now kind of take the role of the ancient priests. They are like priests, in other words, they have, knowledge. They have some truths, that can guide us and so on and so forth. They have answers. They can intervene, in nature and help us survive and so on. That's what religion used to do in the past, of course. So at any rate, so now we turn to the technological revolution, because after all, after scientists accumulated all of this knowledge, ever since Newton, of course, there's been a lot of research, a lot of observations, a lot of inquiry, if you will, done by European scientists, American scientists, of course, in many fields. And the gathering of all of those observations, material observations, again, about the elements of nature, the chemical compositions and the forces and so on, this is going to end up in the creation of new tools, so new technologies. So the scientific revolution by default brought a technological revolution. Knowledge, the knowledge of tool making. That's what technology is really knowledge about crafting tools, okay? How to build tools, and tools are used to help us survive better and thrive better in the environment, okay? That's what tools are intended to do. Sorry. It is really the 19th century where we're going to see a very dramatic um, technological revolution that are going to, this revolution in technology and tool making is going to bring the tools of modern life, okay? The tools that we're so dependent upon today in our world today, we're very dependent upon certain tools that are so essential to our civilization today that if you take away some of them or one of them, again, it's going to be very difficult to have this kind of world that we inhabit, that we have made today. Okay, so there were waves of technological innovations in the late 19th century. I just want to say it's not just the late 19th century. The late 19th century really was the part of that century when those innovations had become pretty much available to large sectors of society, even though some of them came forth early in that century, by the way. Okay, it was the entire century, if you will, the 19th century, when again gave us modern technology. Many of the tools of modern life were born during this time that are so essential, again, to our way of life today. Our economic systems, for example, political systems, are totally dependent upon them. You take away any of them, and we will be thrown back centuries again into the past. Though that's how regressive will be again to take away any of those tools, like electricity. Number one, this is of course a force of nature. This is a natural force that humans have experienced since the beginning of humanity. Again, early humans were the first ones that experienced electricity in the form of lightning. Again, lightning is the most natural, organic expression of this force that scientists call electromagnetism, by the way. Is one of the forces of nature, by the way. And since very early times, back during the early humans, there has been a fascination, an awe, and even terror, felt about electromagnetism, because this was an awesome force that had the capacity to burn up, of course, a tree instantaneously, to melt rock, or to kill a human being, in a second. So people were in awe of that, and also very afraid, so much so that they turned lightning into a god. Early humans, one of the first gods people prayed to in the past was the god of lightning. Okay, and there was always a fascination about that, because humans always wondered, if there were any human being capable of handling lightning, or being the master of that, because it was just so empowering. That what people believed in the past is that any human being that will be able to handle or produce electricity will be so powerful, perhaps the most powerful creature, the most powerful being in nature. Okay, because of its awesome power of creation and destruction. For example, it brings rain, but also it destroys everything that it strikes. So there was a fascination about that led people to worship it and so on. And it is not until we got, of course, the scientific revolution in the 1700s, we're going to see, of course, scientists looking into this field, trying to figure out ways how to generate electromagnetism, so again, scientists in Europe are going to actually work on that tirelessly. And finally, in 1822, there was a Swedish scientist by the name of Hans Christian Oersted who invented the electrical generator, generate electricity. And with that, are going to now be capable of generating one of the forces of nature that is going to empower, in this case, human beings, but particularly the machine age, the age of the machines, because still the machines up to this time had to be pretty much operated manually, or in many cases use water in order to move axles and so on, in order to spin, machinery. And so again, still, water, of course, is very powerful, but electricity is going to come in and now move the machinery of the Industrial Revolution. All of the machines are going to be operated with electricity. Of course, the electrical motor will be invented, and now motors, electrical powered motors, are going to be the ones actually spinning all of the machinery of the Industrial Revolution, starting in the 1820s onwards. So it accelerated the pace of production, because now electricity is moving in a very mysterious way, again, those machines. And again, this is something that, people were simply fascinated. This is, I want you to understand that the coming of electricity was not just, wasn't taken for granted, okay? It was a very mysterious force. It was experienced in the form of lightning, it's true, but now that humans are generating it, there's almost like they're creating lightning and mysteriously making machines move by themselves. So it was bordering on magic, just witnessing that, And so people began to see that it was really electricity that was really the life force of everything. It was the life force inside of the machine, and it was the life force pretty much inside of nature that made everything move. Consider the story of Frankenstein that was written really around this time, late 1790s, early 1800s, the story of Frankenstein, in which you got, of course, a mad scientist, Dr. Frankenstein, really making a monster, and assembled, of course, different body parts from corpses, again, pretty much, stitching them together and so on, and finally giving it life through lightning, electromagnetism. It was shocks, again, shock waves in the head, and that, of course, the monster came to life. Frankenstein is really the metaphor for technology, that you can bring anything that is dead or inanimate, you can bring it to life. You can animate it with electricity, and it can move, it can talk, it can do all wonders. Imagine the computer. The computer is really the imitation of the human brain. It stores data, it has memory, it processes information, etc. But it needs electricity, of course, to function as well. Okay, so you have to go back to those times and try to understand how people were interpreting those changes. Again, there was a magical component to that, in that scientists were delving very closely into the mysteries of nature, the inner workings of the mind of God, and they were kind of like becoming like God, creators, bringing things to life. In other words, animating things that were dead, like a machine, for example, making it work and move by itself, and so on. Very important. Again, so beyond that, electricity is going to impact, of course, economic production, because now it's going to accelerate production. Now you can power up machines, and they can work by the force of electricity. You can accelerate production. Okay, you can maximize output, in other words, and this is going to have also an effect on the economy and the Industrial Revolution as well. Okay, so it's extremely important. And by 1879, we're going to see another gadget that is also going to be powered by electricity, that is going to change also the way people live and work and socialize, and that is the light bulb. Okay, invented by Thomas Edison. Finally, he finally got the final draft, in 1879, and this revolutionized, human civilization forever, because what the light bulb did, it was introduce nightlife, first and foremost, nightlife, this was virtually non-existent in the past in terms of, if people work at night or travel at night. Well, it was, people avoided traveling at night. There was no light, outdoors in the streets or etc. In roads and so on. So people just didn't feel confident to be traveling again in the middle of the night from town to town, or be wandering around town, etc. in the middle of the night again. Or even work itself was limited to daylight. You work during the day, you sleep at night, and that's pretty much it. But now you got artificial lighting. And really what the light bulb is really a gadget that pretty much freezes and traps a piece of that lighting you see outdoors, outside in nature. You kind of bring it, you freeze it, you trap it, and you put it in the light bulb, and you bring it to your home. So that's what light is trapped light. In other words, it's trapped electricity. And this is going to illuminate, of course, homes, offices, factories, parks and streets, and eventually entire cities again will be illuminated. And this is going to bring, human activity is going to be extended into nighttime as well. People working after hours, for example, at offices or at the factory, there will be, night shifts and so on. And of course, people are going to be using, the light bulb to study at night, do more work, or socialize for that matter, take a walk in the park, or etc. Again, so this altered, the way people live, once and for all. It was not simple, to simply, see the advent of this technology and there was no change. There was radical change in the way people live, work, and socialize. Again, with technology always changes. Okay, every piece of tool that it comes about, again, is going to have a profound effect, again, in those areas of human activity. Okay, so the other tool of modern life is modern transportation systems. Now, the railroad really, came about in England in the 1700s, but we're not going to see a railroad revolution in the United States until the 1800s. Okay, not in the 1830s, we're going to see the railroad being developed. The Pennsylvania Railroad was the one developing the railroad across the north, the Northeast, and the Midwest, to be more precise. And after the Civil War and Reconstruction, we're going to see the coming of the railroads all over the country, the South, the Southwest, and also all the Western territories are going to be developed as well, through the coming of the railroad. And so what this allowed for the building of the railroad, again, is to build a transportation system that was very effective, very efficient, that really brought the nation together. Again, not only the U.S., but where the railroad goes, what we see is that those nations are really coming together and they're consolidated, in other words. Because what the railroad does is connect different regions or provinces that are and feel and even want to be separated from one another. Okay, when nations are fragmented into different regions that want to simply remain pretty much disconnected, what the railroad does, the unintended consequence is that by connecting them commercially, and when people begin to move and travel back and forth across the nation, they develop the sense that they share the same nation state, that they live under the same national laws, that, for example, in the U.S., people began to see themselves as Americans. Okay, when the railroad was developed in the 19th century, people were able to travel all over the country for trade, for investment, for vacationing, for relocation, back and forth, and you were able to see how other Americans live. You travel to different parts of the country, you realize that we're all part of the same nation. So it really helped not only to develop a national economy, but also to develop what is called a national identity. The identity that you are part of a nation, for example. Okay, so this is very important. And again, this is a very important tool, transportation systems that allow people to now move large quantities of not only of peoples, again, across state lines, but also to move resources, food, raw materials, manufacture products, again, in ways that were unimaginable in the past, again. So this is another tool that came about in the 19th century that altered the way people live, work, etc., in the U.S. Cities, of course, in the United States are going to also have their own what is called metro rails. Those are still like a city railroad. People move, around again. In the 19th century, there was no automobiles, so the way people moved about again in the American cities was through the metro rail. Okay, something I'm going to actually discuss in a future topic and more in depth, of course. So I'm just talking here about the tools of modern life, the technological revolution that took place in the 19th century. Now, number 3 is that there was also significant changes taking place in the way that people communicated. Okay, and communication systems now were transformed forever with the advent of the telegraph and the telephone. Okay, so what this did again is scientists were very much interested in accelerating the pace of communication, enabling human beings to communicate across vast spans of space instantaneously, if possible. They said, well, let's just delve into the technologies that we can develop to connect people, of course, so they can communicate, of course, messages. Of course, in the 1840s, we're going to see the invention of the telegraph by Samuel Morse, who really used the principles of electricity, using 2 wires. Electricity travels in 2 wires, one positive, the other one negative, and having, of course, at both ends of the wires, having gadgets that are actually sending beeps. You're switching on and off, or you're beeping, if you will, in sequence messages. So on the other side, the person will have to know the numerical value of every beep. For every letter of the alphabet, there's going to be a numerical value. How many beeps are for each letter? And so that's how it all started. I'm going to actually send you some beeps. Somebody's going to interpret what that is and write it and give you, of course, the message. And you got a message. You can communicate with somebody across state lines, somebody even 1,000 miles away from you, by using those electrical wires and just knowing the code. There's a specific code that you have to learn in order to decode the message, in other words. It all started like that. Might seem very unsophisticated and simplistic from our perspective, but this accelerated the way, and the pace by which humans communicated, okay? And it was not until the 1870s that another scientist developed another device using the same electrical wires, but in this case, using them to create a microphone and a speaker on one end and another on the other end of the cable, so they can actually talk to each other and hear each other. And that's the telephone. That's what it is. You got, a speaker and a mic, and, somebody else is going to actually hear you and talk to you and so on. That can be hundreds, thousands of miles away, again, as well. Alexander Graham Bell was the scientist who actually, innovated the telephone in the 1870s. And likewise, it was, revolutionizing communication technology in ways that people during this time considered them to be so mysterious, so wonderful, bordering on magic. In other words, that this was, like witchcraft, for example. How is it that you can talk to somebody miles, hundreds of miles away, and how is it that the voice of that person travels through the wire? Again, so for the untrained mind, this was very, very mysterious. But for the scientific mind, this was just the laws of nature. Again, if you have the understanding of the laws of nature, there's no magic. Okay, but consider for a moment that the people living in this time are not taking this for granted. They're, in many cases convinced that this new science, modern science, that was the correct one. People said, because they said they must be doing something right, because look what they have delivered. They're delivering, in other words. It's not just that they think or say that they got it, that they got the right method or the right approach, but look at electricity, look at motors, how they move by themselves and so on. Look at the telegraph, look at the telephone, So those are technologies that could only be built upon a knowledge that was gathered by the precise method, they will say. So this is just, what I'm saying here is that how people thought, during this time. This is not to say that this was an accurate statement or that I'm confirming their beliefs or etc. I'm just saying that the people of the 19th century, thought that way because of the new tools, the new gadgets, if you will, that have never even been imagined in the past. They're now materializing. So they're going to still held very steadfast again to the science as, the science that was going to deliver, in other words, solutions and so on. Again, so another thing is that, what the advent of telecommunication systems like the telegraph and the telephone did was usher what is called the information age. Today we live in the information age. This undeniably, because of the internet, the World Wide Web, satellites, cell phones, streaming, you name it. Okay. So it right now we experience it. It is no doubt. We send information around the world instantaneously. It travels around the world. News travel around the world. Messages or ideas of all kinds, travel around the world instantaneously. You can talk to somebody at the other end of the world, instantaneously. You can see them and so on. Okay, so we live in the information age. This is exactly what the communication systems I just described initiated, and it's been accelerating ever since. But also, what I want to actually, indicate here is that one of the effects that the information age has had on people that are connected to information systems and that are constantly receiving information, okay, is that people have experienced, something that many people around the world pretty much report, and that is the experience of time accelerating, in other words, time acceleration, okay, the quickening of time. Does that mean that time is going faster? No, time is not going faster. But the more information that comes to us, the more that data we have to process. So our minds have been filled with information because it's easily available at all times, and we're pretty much plugged to it, in our phones, etc., TV, computers, and so on. Okay, so we're constantly bombarded with information, and that information the mind has to process. So the more that information has to process, the faster our thinking process goes. So our mind is always, again, thinking and chattering and processing data. And the faster the mind is thinking, the faster we sense time goes. The time doesn't go anywhere. Time doesn't flow fast or slow. In fact, what science today tells us is that time is a construct of the mind. It doesn't exist. It only exists in the mind, in other words. So if you think very fast, if you have a lot of thoughts, you sense that time is accelerating. But if you still the mind, if you clear it from thoughts, if you bring it to a point of still, time actually stops. Okay, so this is another again issue that is affecting the human mind. Modern technology is actually affecting the way people experience, for example, time in general. Okay, so now let's move forward and look at, for example, another tool of modern life, which is modern life that was born in the late 19th century, is chemistry. Chemistry, was actually a field of inquiry that was born from a previous field of inquiry known as alchemy. In the old science of old, also had their own chemists, but they were called alchemists. That, in fact, the word chemistry came from the word alchemy, by the way. Okay, in the old science, the chemists were alchemists because they were studying the molecules of the chemical compounds of nature for the purpose of trying to bring about potions, that could stop aging, that could prolong the lifespan of individuals, to make them young forever, for example, or heal sickness and so on. And they also had their own labs making potions from herbs, doing incantations and spells and all of that. Think of Merlin, for example. Merlin the wizard was an alchemist, for example, in the legends. So in the 1800s, now that there's a scientific method that is very materialistic, many of the old alchemists became chemists. And they're also going to be in labs and making potions, etc., trying to understand the chemicals, the elements of nature, so charting them, and so on. That's exactly what they're pursuing, understanding the building blocks, again, of creation, the tiny bricks that make up matter. Okay, what are those? What are the elements, again? What are the compounds that make up those elements, and so on? So in 1870, we're going to see the first elemental table, in which the chemists are already presenting to the world some of the major elements that have been discovered so far, up to 1870. And of course, today there's more, elements that have been added, because the more chemistry discovers, of course, elements, the more that they add, of course. So again, this is like a chart of the different compositions of matter. In other words, is very pervasive in terms of the mass, the charge, and everything you need to know about those elements is presented there. Okay, the elemental particles of the universe. This is what now chemists are engaged in. Of course, they're using an instrument, a microscope, to look at matter in general. Anything that you want to know what is made up of, like a leaf, a piece of skin, or the skin of an animal, or human blood, or a rock, doesn't matter. Okay, you can actually sense that. You can use your senses. In this case, you can see it under the microscope, so you can detect how it behaves, what are the particles, and so on and so forth. So again, this is what the chemists are doing now in labs. Using the microscope, they use the light bulb. They put a light, and of course, they can see much better with that, again, microscopically. And they're now really understanding the chemical composition, the chemical substances, and the compounds, again, of those chemicals, in how they form matter. Okay, how they are come together to form the bark of a tree, or anything that you want to actually understand the compounds of. You can actually detect that through that research, the microscopic research. So what this is going to do is that, in many cases, what chemists are actually revealing is that at a microscopic level, many of the elements, again, that make up matter have like a mineral composition. Certain minerals in which the compounds of those minerals that everything, of course, is composed of, really look geometrical, like geometrical shapes. They call those cubes, okay? So under the microscope, what matter appears as, again, like, for example, the mineral composition, again, of matter, is that many of those minerals at a microscopic level, when you look at those compounds, they look like little tiny bricks, but they're like cubes, like geometrical shapes that come together with another, and everything appears to be geometrical at some level. In other words, at some level of reality, nature starts to reveal herself as geometry, in other words, okay, very geometrical. So this revelation is going to have an impact in the way people are going to see reality, okay? Perhaps not all people in general are going to see that, but the people that actually study science or are informed or are influenced by the writings, the ideas of chemistry, they're going to use those ideas to start projecting, again, reality in the way that chemistry is telling us. For example, the artist. Okay, artists are now, using the ideas of chemistry to start actually portraying nature, portraying reality in a very geometrical way, because what the artists are saying, well, this is reality. It's not like this is something I imagine. So instead of painting people the way they appear on the surface, I'm going to project people or landscapes as they appear, in the world of nature at a microscopic level. So I'm going to go deeper into one of those fundamental layers of reality in nature to actually paint nature as it appears, of course, at that microscopic, of course, level. Of course, that led to Cubism. It was an artistic movement of the late 19th century, early 20th century in Europe and in the US. The artists were painting actually faces or individuals, landscapes, again, in this fashion, because they said this is real. This is more real than trying to paint somebody like a photograph, an exact replica of that person, because that person only appears like this to my eyes, but this is just the outer shell. How I see people, how I see the world is just the outer shell, the surface of reality, but it doesn't tell the whole story. This is the other story, in other words. Okay, the face of a human being, or a couple having a conversation in a bar, etc. Even the background is painted like that, like cubes, like geometrical shapes, and so on and so forth. So this is very important because art is a way to understand really how people are thinking or perceiving the world. At any given time, if you really want to find out how a society is doing, how a society sees the world, what are their meanings, their perceptions, study their art. Because what the artists are doing is pretty much portraying the ways that people are framing the universe. Okay? And it varies from culture to culture, from time to time, but nonetheless, it's a good indicator, again, of how society is doing, or how society is, of course, perceiving the world. Of course, the late 19th century Cubism is a perfect example of that, geometry, because of chemistry. Okay. Now, the fifth and last tool of modern life came in the form of medicine. Medicine is also a tool. It is, okay. It's a tool for healing, okay, to restoring balance in the human organism, of course. It's also a tool. And it's going to also revolutionize, again, the way people are going to use tools to address things like sickness or injuries, wounds, etc. Because what modern science, again, that really was born in the late 19th century, is going to do is actually introduce, a model of the human organism that was consistent with the model of modern science. In that, what the new doctors are going to say is, well, if the universe is a material machine, okay, that works very mechanistically. There's also all sorts of mechanical laws making the world function, because it's like a clock. It's a material clock. So they said the body must be the same thing. It must be a machine that has certain mechanisms that either keeps it healthy or mechanisms that makes it sick. So all we have to do is study human anatomy, understanding what are the parts, the organs, what organ is responsible for what, how they work together, and understanding what brings sickness, in other words. What are the mechanisms of sickness, in other words, and trying to restore, the body, through mechanical, procedures, like think of a surgery, for example, okay? It's like a mechanical intervention, on the machine. So it's very mechanistic, modern medicine. And so, again, there's going to be a lot of dissections. Doctors are going to be dissecting corpses and pretty much making a map of the organs, identifying them, how they're connected, and and having a very good understanding, again, of the human body as a machine. And there will be, breakthroughs, of course, in the late 19th century by certain biologists, by looking at, of course, the microscope and looking at how the world the body works, particularly the blood. Looking at the blood under the microscope. Louis Pasteur, the French biologist, he was the one who actually detected, of course, in the blood, how the mechanism of sickness and disease, particularly epidemic disease, actually function by discovering the immune system, of course, white blood cells fighting off, things like germs and viruses and so on and so forth. So he revealed a whole new world of microscopic organisms. We call microorganisms. Again, like microbes, germs, bacteria, and so on, and how they behave inside of the body, how the body fights off, of course, those organisms. So he's going to be very famous for revealing, the existence of those entities that people thought of, imagined in the past existed. Whenever there was epidemic disease, people kind of guessed that there was something that was making the person sick could be passed on to another person. Contagion, for example, you can actually infect somebody and make it sick. So something was being passed from person to person, but it is not until the microscope and actually the application of this research, again, this method, the scientific method, that's biologists are going to actually reveal the existence of, again, those entities, again, microscopic entities, okay, microorganisms they're called, of course. And the immune system, of course, that led to vaccines, the idea that you can actually inject a portion or a very weakened actually virus, for example, into a person, to make it actually develop antibodies, for example, again. So we're going to see, of course, the introduction of new technologies. Modern medicine introduced something like vaccines, to create some form of immunity in people, so to increase the lifespan of individuals, that is to say. Okay, so we got the introduction of vaccines and also pharmaceutical drugs. Although back then we're not going to see yet the coming of the large pharmaceutical companies, but rather those were actually chemists that were making those potions in their own labs at home. They were called drugs, like syrups, brews, that they will sell, in the local pharmacy, for, things like migraines, things like, constipation, for example, stomach problems, and so on and so forth, and so people will drink that and, thought they were actually, getting medicine. So there were a lot of cure-all potions, brews you will see on supermarkets and so on all across the country. I mean, they were filled with those pharmaceutical drugs, because people had a lot of faith in the new science that they were actually delivering, of course, now medicine based on chemical research into the world of plants and so on, medicinal properties of plants, and that they were actually brewing those plants and giving you, again, a medicine, of course. And last but not least, another offshoot of the modern medicine came in the form of psychology and psychiatry. Again, the new psychology, the new psychiatry was born from the premise that the mind was really produced by the brain. They said, well, the brain must be the organ that handles the mind. So if the mind has any problems, it has to be the brain, in other words. Okay, that was the basic understanding. Something happening in the brain causes the mind to be unstable. And so the psychologists and psychiatrists very early on tried to pretty much come up with ways to deal with mental disorders, not by taking into account, for example, demons or demonic possession or spirit possession, but rather looking at mental disorders caused by malfunctioning, again, in the human brain. And putting people, again, in mental institutions that were unstable, that needed therapy, called mental asylums. So you're not going to send them to the priest for an exorcism. You're going to send people with mental disorders to a mental asylum where they can be given treatment. And because there was a fascination with electricity back then as to be one of the most awesome, mysterious forces of the universe, in many cases, people in the mental asylums were given electroshocks, thinking that was going to bring people to their senses, that people were, perhaps out of their minds and so on, that needed to be brought, to their senses, and in many cases, they received electroshock therapy just to see if that would work. Didn't work, of course. So at any rate, so again, those were the most important tools of modern life that gave us, in this case, things like, for example, electricity. It gave us telecommunications and telephone, the telegraph, modern transportation systems as well. It gave us chemistry as well. We're going to see the advent of chemistry, vaccines, and pharmaceutical drugs as well, and also modern medicine in terms of psychology, psychiatry, and so on. Okay, so at any rate, so this is very important because that was really a technological revolution, that it really initiated modern technology, the technology of today, and everything that has been happening ever since is simply an improvement, a building upon, if you will, of those technologies to make them more sophisticated, more efficient, more advanced, again, to the point that we have gotten today. Now, part two, we move into part two to look at economic progress now. Again, this is another area I explained in the introduction. That also Americans were very much focused on, influenced by, when it came to this idea called progress. They were also thinking about economic progress as well. So this is something that they were projecting also into the world of economics. It was not just knowledge and technology that is going to create a better world. It is also that in order to create a better world, we also have to create, of course, an economic system that is going to improve the standards of living of the population, so they can have security, they can have prosperity, they can have well-being, a sense of well-being, and ultimately to be happy. Okay, so again, this is going to be part of the idea of progress that came about with the rise of capitalism. Okay, so I explained that in the introduction. You can always use your notes that I presented in the introduction to complement this. I was just pretty much painting again, pretty much the background, again, of the idea of progress, back in the beginning in session one, pretty much for you to actually see all of the changes that were taking place during those times that convinced Americans that progress was just inevitable, it was desirable, and that we should actually attain it and work at it, as much as possible. Economic progress. So in the 17 and 1800s, I mentioned that we're going to see in England the rise of a new economic system that replaced the old system of the past, just like modern science replaced the old system of the past based on religion. So that was really a scientific revolution. Also, capitalism, was considered an economic revolution because it also replaced feudalism. You can go back again to the introduction. I was talking about, feudalism was, a system in which wealth creation was very difficult because it was pretty much concentrated in the monarchy, in the nobility and church. So it was very difficult for the general population to experience progress, just because the resources, the entitlements to land, water, and everything else was in the hands, again, of the landowners. And so it is really not until the 1700s when in England, starting in England, then later on into, moving into other places of Europe and North America, we're going to see reforms. That we're going to see the reforms of the modern states, in which modern states, the rise of more democratic states, are going to now introduce in the constitutions, again, of their countries, certain rights that now permitted the citizens to own property, the private ownership, again, of land and resources, that now you can actually just buy it. If you have the money, you are now going to be able to actually, buy it. Okay, so this came about again in the 1700s in England, when England was actually undergoing what is called an industrial revolution. Okay, it was not just that it was introducing a new reforms, to allow people to own property, to bring about capitalism, but at the same time, there was also an industrial revolution taking place in England, the coming of industries and factories and so on in England, that is going to spread like wildfire also across Western Europe, France, Holland, Germany, and of course in the 1800s as well in the United States. It was really, again, an economic revolution, because it was really creating a whole new economic system, reorganizing human societies in a way that allow, once again, people to own property. That was literally, again, difficult, if not impossible, for the vast majority of human societies worldwide because of the feudal systems, the feudalism, again, the concentration of all land and resources among the landowners, the monarchs, and so on. But now, that system is coming to an end, and now people can actually own property, because under capitalism, the idea is that people should strive to generate wealth. Again, capitalism is based on that notion. Build wealth, and the first step, of course, to build wealth is that if the wealth is yours. So that's why you have to be able to allow people to own property, because the wealth that you're about to build has to be yours, in other words, private property. But furthermore, once you own that property, then you can actually invest in some form of business or business venture or enterprise that you're going to use to generate wealth. It's called free enterprise. In other words, you have to free people in the economy to pursue their own self-interest, to pursue their own path to human happiness. Okay, and so therefore you have to allow people to pretty much open up whatever business they would like to open. Okay? Somebody has the intention to actually offer the best kind of bread again to the people of the city. You love baking. You're a baker, and so you can open up your own bakery. In other words, and if you love that, you love doing that, then you can have your business. You can manage it. Is yours. Are you going to please people with your product? In other words, it's called free enterprise, which brought, of course, a multiplicity of different businesses. Capitalism in England and in the U.S. and other places of Europe where capitalism was flourishing, we're going to see, of course, a multiplicity again of different enterprises, shops, and industries, factories, businesses of all kinds, and so on. People are simply rushing in to open up their own business, in other words. And number three, we're going to also, in capitalism again, introduce also a system of what is called wage labor. This is another very important characteristic of capitalism. Capitalism is also a system in which it tells you that if you don't have the money to buy land or open up your own business, you can always sell your labor. In other words, you can actually work for somebody for a wage. So your labor is capital. Your labor is valuable. That is to say, and you have the opportunity to apply to a multiplicity of different places. And if they hire you, well, you can just be hired, and so on and so forth. Okay, so at any rate, so this is extremely important. How capitalism introduced certain changes that were not really present in the old feudal order. Okay, the idea of private property, free enterprise, and wage labor. Those are key features of this new capitalist society. People are owning their own property. There's multiplicity of different businesses flourishing, and of course, you got also, this wage labor as well. All right, so. So beyond this, we're going to see that in capitalism, again, capitalist societies, and like the ones I just described, that introduce particularly, again, those new reforms, those new ways of organizing society, that is to say, what we're going to look at here is that what we're going to see is, of course, now a new phenomenon, again, in which we're going to see the movements of people in a sort of economic ladder, that there's going to be in society a kind of ladder in which people now have the flexibility, in other words, to be moving up and down, so to speak. In feudalism, that was almost impossible to do, because under feudalism, in many cases, the place where you were born, the kind of class, the conditions from where you were born, that's where you will stay, for the rest of your life. It was very difficult to move upward, that is to say, the economic ladder in feudalism, because it was a very rigid, again, social system, by the way. And your status was always, for the most part, inherited. People inherited the status of their parents and so on. But now what we're going to see is that we're going to see now society, in capitalist societies, again, we're going to see society being pretty much subdivided into different classes of people, because we're going to see, for example, that some individuals are going to be part of what is called the working class. Those are the individuals that are working in factories or industries, just selling your labor, that is to say, operating machines or doing physical work, just to, maybe subsist from that work. Whereas there will be yet another class of individuals that are going to be, in many cases, the small business owners, the shopkeepers, for example, the small scale manufacturers, or the professional managerial class. Those are the experts, the people that have education and skills, to actually administer, for example, the company, or administer a business, administer an industry in terms of running the books, or being the supervisors or the engineers, the chemists that are the ones fixing the machines and so on. And so because of their skills, because of their knowledge, they're paid higher wages, and so they belong to now, they distinguish themselves from, of course, the working class, and so they become part of another class called the middle class. In this case, okay, so societies now, you can see that there are different classes, of course, of people, and that it is very evident that a substantial number of people in those new societies have risen that economic ladder. They have climbed that ladder, if you will, and they have become part of a whole new class that is neither part of the working class, but they're not yet, of course, part of the upper class as well. They're not super rich or anything, but this gave the sense that there's the opportunity, for upward mobility. It's called upward mobility, is that you can actually move upward through your effort, through your dedication, your aspirations. If you aspire to be more than what you are, if you want to receive education so you can get a higher pay, and so on, that you can. In other words, look, all you need to do is just pretty much, discipline yourself, work very hard, and you'll be able to pretty much improve or progress, your economic well-being. That is to say, this is something, again, that people witnessed during those times, that it was possible. Not that it was guaranteed or that it was automatic, that was going to happen, but, under feudalism, the system of the past, that was almost impossible, okay, to rise up the ladder. It was just very difficult, in other words. But in capitalism, there was still, a possibility there, for you to do so, in other words. So by the 1800s, particularly the latter part of the 1800s, the late 19th century, this is extremely important. What we're going to see is that the leading capitalist societies of the world, the ones I just mentioned, including the United States, are going to now lead the way, so to speak, in terms of the rest of the world that was still living under a feudal system, still in many different forms. There's feudalism exists in many different forms, depending where you actually go. That all over the world, people looked at the United States perhaps as an example of what they could become, in other words. So what those leading modern economies were saying is that, look, you can develop your economy if your nation has not yet experienced, an economic boom. You have not yet experienced, for example, the creation of businesses. You don't have a middle class. If you don't have this, you can actually do that if you accept or you institute capitalism. That is to say, you have to allow people to own property, you have to allow free enterprise, and of course bring in what is called wage labor. Of course, those are the three pillars, again, of capitalism. Okay, and so again, what they were actually saying is that you have to move towards capitalism in order to attain those kinds of changes, attain progress, in other words. Okay, and so in the late 19th century, capitalism was not necessarily coined or known as capitalism. In the late 19th century, the leading capitalist societies were simply, again, known for having an economic system that was described as economic liberalism or laissez-faire. This is what, again, it was being advertised, and that is, if you want economic development, you have to free the economy, in other words, from all the constraints. That's what's called economic liberalism. And all the constraints, again, that the state can have on people. So you have to free people, liberate society, liberate people to pursue their own needs, their own self-interest, their own happiness, in other words. That's called economic liberalism. So you have to allow them to own property, do businesses, and so on and so forth. Okay, that's what's called economic liberalism or economic liberty. Okay, laissez-faire is a French term that says hands off, that the state will have to get the hands off the economy and allow the economy to be run by people, in other words, on their own. Okay, so back then it was known again as economic liberalism or laissez-faire. But what in reality, again, capitalism, what was so different from any other system around the world that a lot of people were confronted with, that were not capitalist. In other words, that what nations heard that this is what is going to bring economic progress, economic development to your country, adopt capitalism. What they actually were confronted with, it was not just so much about private property, free enterprise, and wage labor. What capitalism actually was so different from any other system of the past was that it actually was a very individualistic type of system. Capitalism sees human beings as individuals and not as groups, that is to say. Okay, so this is how different and even revolutionary capitalism was, because it actually introduced the notion that, look, you have to just see people as individuals. Every individual is very different from one another. Every individual has different likes and dislikes. There's not going to be two people that are exactly the same. So therefore, you have to treat people as individuals. And every individual has a specific, idea about happiness. So let the individual pursue their own path of happiness, that is to say. What makes happy to somebody is not exactly to the other, in other words. Okay? And the individual is responsible to attain that happiness, in other words. It is up to you whether you want to be rich or poor. It is up to your own work, discipline, dedication, commitment, whether you want to succeed in life or not. This is what capitalism says, again, that you cannot blame anybody for your shortcomings, for your success as well. It's all on you, in other words. And so what that means, of course, for a lot of societies around the world is that all the stress is on the individual. So therefore, what that means is that in many societies that see themselves as groups, where people actually work in groups, and that the group is the most important than the individual, group survival, group success, group community enterprise, as it's called. A lot of societies just fear capitalism because they're going to say this is going to break up our communities. Because if you tell us that we're just individuals and everybody's supposed to be just, pursuing their own path, then everybody's going to pretty much, go different ways. People are going to abandon their families. People are going to move into different directions. This is not going to work out, of course. So, of course, because it's very individualistic. In many other societies, people see the community as the most important social organism that must be kept alive. People follow their elders. What the elders indicate must be done, not what they want. When they do work, they work in groups. Okay, when they go farming, people go out in groups and farm or fish or hunt. It's group enterprise, it's community enterprise, of course. It's not like I did it myself and this is mine because I worked that and so on. Many societies around the world, Asia, for example, and there's many societies in Africa, among the Native Americans, in this continent is the same thing. So again, this is very different from the ways, again, that other societies operate. So what capitalism is saying is that, look, if you want capitalism, you have to treat people as individuals and set them pretty much free. And of course, this is going to be resisted in many cases by other societies. That it's important for individuals to obey the family, like arranged marriages. In other societies, you have to marry the person that your family is telling you because of family interest. You're marrying another family. You're not marrying, just a person. The family interests are, getting together to help each other. So this is not something that you are going to choose on your own. But capitalism, what capitalism is saying that no, you have to let the individual choose, what they want to do, what kind of work they want, what they want to study, etc. So again, see that again is what kind of change. Another, of course, change that capitalism is going to bring is, of course, the idea of competition, that individuals must compete with each other for the jobs or the opportunities or resources or positions. And so that's part of the game. Capitalism pretty much sees this again, society in general, pretty much as composed of individuals that are competing for this a certain amount of wealth, and so the most competitive, the most decisive, are going to actually win the race. In other words, like a race. In other words, so again, this is also another issue that contrasted with other cultures and societies around the world, because other cultures and societies are based on cooperation. Now you have to cooperate with the group, not compete, because otherwise we're not going to survive. But in capitalism, of course, has led to intense rivalry and competition between people, sometimes leading to something called cutthroat competition. But again, it's part of of the capitalist mentality, if you will. Okay, and last but not least, again, another really important feature of capitalism is the idea of consumerism. Okay, it's not just a system where you build wealth for the sake of building the wealth, but rather that the goal is that once you build that wealth and become part of the middle class, or even beyond that, is that you're going to enjoy yourself, find fulfillment in this world through the consumption of goods and services. Okay, this is how you're going to enjoy your wealth. You're going to be able to use your money to purchase those things that make you happy. And this is how we reach, the ideal, society. It's called the middle class paradise. In other words, consumerism, another feature again of capitalism that led to the rise of consumer culture. Something we're going to actually look at, of course, much later in the 20th century. But in some, of course, economic progress that was attained in the United States, again, through this process called capitalism, was considered to be something desirable, something that people should strive and work very hard, because the higher you reach in the economic ladder, the closer you'll get to this paradise again on earth. That is, again, the idea that the more wealth, the more affluence, the more comforts, and the more enjoyment and fulfillment. It's almost like you have reached heaven, in other words. Okay, so that's another thing, of course. And so again, just a closing note here is that capitalism was not alone in the late 19th century proposing a path of economic development. This is how you develop your economy. Capitalism is going to have competition from ideologies, economic ideologies, again, about progress that were coming from Europe. Okay, so Europeans are going to devise, of course, alternative visions of the future for reorganizing society in a way that it will get you to a paradise. In other words, every ideology is trying to bring a paradise. Capitalism is trying to bring one, okay? The consumer paradise. But in Europe, we're going to see, the introduction of ideologies like socialism and communism, in which the socialist paradise was one in which wealth is going to be distributed in a way that those that could not compete under capitalism, like the elderly, for example, people that could not work for many reasons because of sickness, etc., single mothers or orphans, etc., will be, of course, assisted, taken care of by the state. That's what socialism is. That, okay, look, the paradise is one in which, you have capitalism, you have that, but the people that fall behind, that cannot compete, will be assisted by the state, what we call social welfare, for example. Okay, that's one. And in communism, again, the communist paradise is one in which there's no social classes. Again, in Europe, people fantasize again about a paradise in which nobody owns anything, and so therefore there's no competition whatsoever. Okay, no classes whatsoever. Okay, so there's going to be, of course, competition in the 20th century between the different ideologies at the world stage. By the way, the world will become ideologically divided, as we'll see once we move into the 20th century, between different ideologies, that each ideology proposed, a system to guide human societies towards this paradise on earth. That's the whole thing. What all those ideologies are striving to do is create an earthly paradise. And capitalism says, in order to get there, you have to do this, okay? You have to be competitive, individualistic, you have to, own property and all that. And socialism, you have to have welfare, for example. In communism, you abolish social classes and so on. And so they're going to become at odds, and there's going to be intense competition in the world stage to see which ideology was going to prevail, in other words, as to bringing heaven on earth, in other words. Okay, so this is the end, again, of session 2. When we come back, we're going to now move into the third part. It's going to be fascinating. Is going to look at the theory of evolution, how Americans are going to interpret also biological progress, as part of, nature as well. In other words, that progress is also taking place in nature, not just us. It's not just human beings trying to progress and advance, but nature is also doing it in the world of biology. Life forms and organisms are also evolving, they're progressing, getting themselves better, and how those ideas are going to be projected by Americans to understand, for example, things like capitalism and, race and all that. Again, when we come back, of course, to look at session 3. This is all I have for you, and I'll see you then in session 3 of this topic when we come back. Thank you.